Good morning. In this last lecture of applied linguistics, we'll examine the second technique, which is error analysis. This technique is very related to second language acquisition. We are dealing with these techniques in the form of a chronology, that is to say, in terms of time. Error analysis is the earliest approach to the study of second language acquisition, which includes an internal spotlight on learners' creative capacity to construct language. We mean by that it pays attention to the creative aspect of language. Error analysis is founded on the description and scrutiny, that is, the examination of real learner errors in a second language. This shows that error analysis is based on real errors, not on prediction of errors before they occur. Error analysis has nothing to do with the linguistic structures of the first language of learners and the second language they are learning. We said that we are dealing with the techniques of applied linguistics as in terms of time. In the 70s, error analysis replaced constructive analysis. On the whole, error analysis added much useful insights to second language acquisition research, and it had interesting pedagogical applications, that is, classroom applications. Let's now try to define error analysis. But before doing so, let's remember what contrastive analysis is. We said previously that contrastive analysis is the comparison of languages, the L1 and L2, the first language of the learner and the second language, or the language, the target language. Contrastive analysis compares them in order to find the similarities and differences and to predict errors. Error analysis is different. Error analysis, the abbreviation is EA, is the study of a learner's linguistic performance with focus on errors. What is meant by the linguistic performance of the learner is the writing or the speech of the learner. We understand from that error analysis is the study of the errors which occur in the speech or writing of learners. Now, it is important to define the term error itself. The term error means a deviation from the target language or a faulty version of the rules of the target language. Let's take an example of an error. A learner, for instance, said they are or they is hungry instead of saying they are hungry. Or he may say Helen worked hard last year instead of saying Helen worked hard last year. So we notice in these two examples that the target language rule, the one related to the plural, is transgressed in the first example. Instead of saying they are hungry, the learner says they is hungry. And in the second example, instead of using the past tense marker ed, the learner drops this marker and writes or says work hard last year. We notice in these two examples that the rules of the target language were violated, producing a faulty version, the learner's version. This faulty version is an error. In these two examples, obviously the errors are grammatical, but error analysis is not restricted only to grammar. It can cover any form of error at any level of language. It can be an error can happen in spelling, in pronunciation, in grammar, in the choice of a lexical item, and so on. There is another definition provided by Ellis of error analysis. In this definition, error analysis is described as a set of procedures for identifying describing and explaining errors in learner language. The word procedure implies steps. That is to say, error analysis has steps. The steps of error analysis cannot be reversed. It starts with the identification, then description, and then the explanation of errors. It is said that error analysis is comparative. We previously said that contrastive analysis is also comparative, but they are not the comparison is not the same. In contrastive analysis, the researcher compares the first language, the structures of the first language of the learner, for example Arabic, with the structures of the second language of the learner. The objective of this comparison in contrastive analysis is to find the similarities and differences between the languages themselves. And then, it is believed that the areas of differences will cause errors in the learning of a second language. Error analysis is comparative too, but not in the same way. In error analysis, what is compared is different. The error analyst compares, on the one hand, the language of the learner, the speech or the writing of the learner, and the target language. This is how both contrastive analysis and error analysis are comparative, and how they differ in this comparison. The language of the learner is called the interlanguage. An important aspect of error analysis is that the errors of the learners are not attributed only to the mother tongue, to interference from the mother tongue, and they are not predicted from the areas of differences between languages. The errors that the error analysts describe have nothing to do with prediction. They are real errors. They are described and dealt with after they occur. Every technique has some theoretical basis. So let's examine the theoretical foundations of error analysis. The first theoretical foundation of error analysis is related to the way of looking at errors. That is to say, the status of errors. The status of errors has changed in this new paradigm. A comparison with the contrastive analysis paradigm will serve our purpose here. In contrastive analysis, errors were undesirable, and the contrastive analysts believed that they are a sign of failure to learn the second language. But in error analysis, the errors are seen as tokens or signs of learning. They prove that learning is taking place. Errors show us the inner workings of the language learning process. They are indicators of what goes on in the learner's mind. Seen in this way, errors are considered as a natural or even a necessary part of second language learning. The second theoretical foundation of error analysis is its mentalistic orientation. Contrastive analysis was saturated with behavioristic ideas, but error analysis is characterized by its cognitive affiliation. This reflects Chomskyan mentalistic ideas. In mentalism, the language learner actively processes the input he receives. Learners are not passive. They use their minds in order to process language. When learning the second language, learners change their system of rules subsequently. Error analysts argue that the errors are evidence of a system the learner is using at a particular point in the learning process. They are an indicator of rule-making. Error analysts believe that the same processes are involved in learning a person's first language or any other language. Because of its mentalistic orientation, The error analysts reject the use of some terms, like the term error, deviant, or ill-formed, because they have a negative implication. These terms imply that the learner knows a rule and violates that rule, but this is not the case when learning a second language. The learner does not know the rule yet. He forms his own rules. These terms are substituted by another neutral term, which is idiosyncratic. So instead of saying a deviant structure, the error analyst says an idiosyncratic structure. What are the objectives of error analysis? We've seen previously that contrastive analysis has some well-defined objectives: comparing languages, finding similarities and differences between them, and then predicting errors and designing teaching materials according to this prediction. Error analysis has different objectives. The first one is to identify the strategies which learners use in language learning. The second one is to identify the causes of learner errors. This is called the explanation of errors, and it is a psycholinguistic process. The third objective is to obtain information on common difficulties in language learning, and this can be taken as an aid to teaching or in the preparation of teaching materials. Error analysis here serves teachers because it enables them to have an idea about the common difficulties of their learners. When teachers know about the common difficulties, this will help them in revising their teaching materials or designing new teaching materials. Generally, we can classify these objectives into two categories. The first and the second objectives are theoretical, while the third one is practical. Being theoretical means being directed to researching second language acquisition processes, and being practical means serving the classroom, the language classroom. On this basis, we can distinguish two types of error analysis. The first is called developmental error analysis, and it is about how language learning goes on. And the second is a remedial error analysis, and this is related to how to benefit from the analysis of errors in the classroom. There is a close link between research in second language acquisition and the work of error analysts. This link is evident in developmental error analysis. At a later stage of its development, the analysis of learners' errors became a major contributor to second language acquisition research because it is concerned with the development stages in language learning. In the error analysis approach, the learner is seen to construct for himself a grammar or competence. We mean by competence a set of abstract rules about the target language. The learner builds up his interlanguage using specific rules. These rules, formulated by the learner, are called hypotheses because they are not permanent. Therefore, competence is seen as a transient in nature. It is not permanent. It changes continuously. The rules which are formulated by the learner, or the hypothesis, are continuously being tested and reformulated. What happens exactly? The learner receives input of the target language, which is presented by the teacher, or which is received from the environment. We say that the learner is exposed to this input, utterances of the target language. The learner processes this input and tries to extract the rules of the target language. But sometimes the rules that are formulated by the learner are false. They do not match the rules of the native speakers. When the rule is false, this will lead the learner to produce an erroneous form or an idiosyncratic form. The learner will use this idiosyncratic form and tests this form. If he notices that it is not accepted, he will try to revise the rule and respect it again and see whether this new rule works well or not. The learner does this continuously until he reaches the correct rule, with its exceptions. A good example of this process is the use of the ed marker with the irregular verbs, or the use of the S, the plural S, with irregular plurals. We understand from this that the errors are signs of the rule-making process. If we analyze the errors themselves, like forms like the word goat or child, this will provide hints about the strategies the learner is using, like the strategy of overgeneralization. The errors will give us an idea about the nature and the characteristics of the learner's competence at a given stage of its development. In the course of learning a second language, interlanguage or the language of the learner develops or progresses little by little. Developmental error analysis attempts to shed light on the successive stages in interlanguage development, and the goal is to understand the universal features of second language learning processes and strategies. In remedial error analysis, things are different. I mean, objectives are different. The researcher is not interested in understanding the stages of second language acquisition, but researchers are interested in serving the classroom. Remedial error analysis represents the pedagogical aspect of the hypothesis. Error analysis here is considered a very useful tool to language teachers. In that case, error analysis is conducted by the teacher himself, and errors can be positively exploited to better teaching. Here we can imagine what happens in the classroom. The first thing is teaching language materials. The second thing is collecting errors or conducting an error analysis. And the third one is analyzing the errors. Finally, getting ideas about the problems of the learners from the analysis of errors. And on the basis of that, it is possible to undertake remediation, also to improve teaching. Pete Corder explains that the errors which are made by the learners are significant to the teacher. In Corder's words, in that they tell him if he undertakes a systematic analysis, how far towards the goal the learner has progressed, and consequently what remains for him to learn. Conducting an error analysis can help the teacher to know what is most troublesome for the learners concerned and where they most need support. Let's take an example. Suppose that a teacher is giving a course in grammar. A lesson of this course is tenses. After presenting a whole lesson of tenses with its activities, then testing the learners through the activities themselves, the teacher will notice that learners make errors in the present perfect tense, particularly. This conclusion is drawn by the teacher on the basis of the errors that learners have made. He notices that most of the learners have made errors in the use or the form of the present perfect tense. This indicates that the present perfect tense form or structure is difficult for learners, and they need support in this area. Now, to remedy the problem, the teacher is not going to focus on all the tenses in the remedial work. Probably he will devote much effort and more interest to the present perfect tense particularly. This is how error analysis can orient the work of the teacher, and it can orient the teaching materials. It orients remediation as well. Remediation can be successfully achieved just on the basis of the errors observed. An important question that should be asked when conducting an error analysis is the following. Should we include in the analysis of errors every deviation that a learner produces? The answer is no. In the approach of error analysis, there is a distinction between two forms of deviations. The first are called errors and the second are called mistakes. Only the errors should be included in error analysis, not the mistakes. So what's the difference between an error and a mistake? To explain this distinction, let's take an analogy. Well, the error is related to competence and the mistake is related to performance. What does this mean? Competence means knowing something, and performance means applying something that we know. Imagine a person trying to perform a song. Let's take the first situation. That person has learned the song well, by heart. In that case, we say that that person knows the song. Then we ask that person to perform the song. He may succeed in doing so in ordinary circumstances, but sometimes he may fail. But this failure does not reflect his incompetence, because we said that he knows the song well. Suppose that this person is tired. At the end of the day, we ask him to perform the song. So the problem that occurred here in that case is only related to performance, to using something that we know already. Suppose that this person takes a rest and we ask him one day after to perform the song and he succeeds. So the problem is related not to his competence, to his ability, but to some external circumstances. We take the case of another person who has not learned the song by heart. It means he doesn't know the song. If we ask him in the early morning to perform it, he will fail. At the end of the day, he will always fail. And even if he has a rest, he will fail, simply because of lack of competence. So now let's move on to the clarification of errors and mistakes in language learning on the basis of this analogy. Errors in language learning arise from lack of knowledge about the target language and the application of a transitional rule. The errors are systematic, they are repeated, and related to competence, the ability, the knowledge of the rule. Errors are not recognized by the learner as an error. Here the learner will repeat the incorrect form again and again without knowing that he is producing an incorrect form. And even if a teacher or anyone shows him the mistake, the deviation, the learner is unable to correct it, simply because he doesn't know the rule. Mistakes are another category of deviation, and they are not interesting to the error analyst. Mistakes are due to chance circumstances, to the context itself, to the situation. Mistakes indicate failure to use a known system correctly. The learner knows the rule, but he only fails to use it correctly under specific circumstances. Mistakes are non-systematic, that is to say, the learner does not repeat them. A mistake may occur only once, but an error may occur 5 times, 6 times in the same piece of language. For instance, if you are tired, you fail to pronounce a word correctly, although you know its correct pronunciation. So mistakes are one-time only events, readily correctable by the learner himself. If you tell the learner that you have made a mistake, well, the learner will automatically correct himself because he knows the rule. Mistakes include slips of the tongue, like false starts, changes of plan, confusion of structures, and so forth. Error analysts say that mistakes increase in frequency, they become more frequent under conditions of stress, when a person is stressed. In the case of indecision, when you are undecided, and also in the case of fatigue or even anger. So mistakes are due to psychological factors. They are not due to cognitive factors. Mistakes fall outside the scope of error analysis. They are analyzed by psychologists. Now, talk about the way of conducting an error analysis or methodology in error analysis. Error analysis is a procedure and it has steps. But before conducting an error analysis, the analyst should collect data. The analyst should collect a sample of learner language. It is called a corpus. The corpus can be spoken or written. The researcher can record the learner, for example, and in that case, the corpus is spoken. Or the researcher can give the learner a written test, and the learners will produce, for instance, a paragraph, an essay, or sometimes the test that is given to the learner is analytical. At the end of collecting data, the researcher will have a sample of the interlanguage or learner language. On the basis of this sample, the analyst can know a lot about what's happening in the mind of the learner. Error analysis has a lot of stages. The first one is the identification of errors. To detect the error, where is the error? Then the description of an error, what sort of error it is. The explanation of errors, or why did the error occur, a psychological explanation. The evaluation of errors means deciding on how serious is the errors. Is it really serious or not? And finally, the correction of errors means giving feedback on them. Now let's take the steps of error analysis one by one, starting with the identification of errors. Identifying errors in speech or writing means detecting them. The researcher should find the errors in his corpus. Where are they exactly? Of course, we should say that researchers will not collect all the errors that they will encounter. They will only focus on the ones which are related to their objective of research. For example, someone who is studying or examining problems in grammar will not be interested in collecting problems in spelling. In the case of research in speaking, someone who is detecting problems in the use of intonation patterns will not be interested in collecting the deviations which occur at the level of sounds and their pronunciation. This is in general. Now let's look at the process of identification itself. Take these two examples. She always borrows him her books, and when you will travel. Suppose that this is part of the corpus. Where are the errors exactly? The researcher will notice that in the first example, the error is in borrow. This is the error. And in the second example, the learner's utterance, the problem is in you will. How can the researcher decide that these are the errors really? This is related to the interpretation that he makes. The researcher will ask in the first case, for example, or in the second, what does the learner mean? So this interpretation is related to the context. By using interpretation, the researcher will decide that in the first case, the learner means she always lends him her books, according to the context. And in the second example, the learner means when will you travel? Also according to the context. Interpretation is sometimes difficult, especially when the learner is absent. Interpretation can be done in two ways, but before talking about that, let's talk about the way errors can be or utterances can be erroneous. Here there are two forms. Utterances can be erroneous in two ways. The first one is overt errors, and the second one is covert errors. So some utterances are overtly erroneous and others are covertly erroneous. Overt errors are superficially deviant. On the surface, they are deviant. On the surface, they break some rule. They are ungrammatical if we take into account the rules of the target language. The two examples that we have are overtly erroneous. Covert errors appear to be grammatical. They seem to be grammatical. On the surface, there is no problem. They are superficially well-formed. But the problem in them is that they are inappropriate in the sense that they do not reflect the learner's intentions in the context of communication. Let's take the example, the book is on the table. On the surface, the utterance is correct. It does not break any rule. But when we take the intention of the learner, we'll discover that he means that the book is under the table. So the utterance is covertly erroneous. Let's return to interpretation itself. Interpretation of the learner's intended meaning are of two sorts. They can be authoritative or plausible. Authoritative interpretation is used when the learner is available, especially when analyzing speaking. Here the learner is asked to translate his utterance to his first language, to know his intended meaning. In case the learner is absent, as it is the case in writing, the researcher will make a plausible interpretation. The researcher will use whatever sources to reconstruct the utterance in an acceptable form. The second stage in error analysis is the description of errors. This means describing the error linguistically. Let's explain this. In the previous stage, which is the identification, the researcher has collected the errors and he has reconstructed them. You see in the two examples, she always borrows him her books. When you will travel, the researcher has reconstructed the first as she always lends him her books. And in the second example, when will you travel? Reconstruction. So the first form, the first example is the learner's original utterance, and the second one is its reconstruction. Then, when you will travel is the learner's original utterance, and the researcher will try to find its reconstruction. When will you travel? The result of the previous stage is pairs of sentences or utterances. the original one and its reconstruction. The original utterance is part of interlanguage, and the reconstruction is part of the target language. The researcher will compare the original utterance and the reconstructed utterance. For this reason, the description of errors is a comparative process. In this stage, the researcher uses two axes in the description. Firstly, he will describe the error as an error of omission or addition, selection, or ordering. And when he follows the second axis, he should decide whether the error is phonological, orthographical, or grammatical, or lexical. When the learner produces an error of omission, he omits some necessary elements. And when he produces an error of addition, he adds something that is not needed. And in the case of selection, the learner selects an incorrect form instead of a correct form, as you see in the table. And finally, the error of misordering means reversing some given order. All four types of omission, addition, selection, and ordering can occur at the phonological level, or at the grammatical level, or at the lexical level. When describing errors, the researcher always refers to the rules of the target language which have been violated. This stage is very difficult in error analysis. Some errors are confusing. For instance, you cannot decide whether an error is grammatical or lexical. So these categories sometimes overlap, and this makes the task of the researcher difficult. Finally, we should say that this model of describing errors was proposed by Bitcorder, and there are other existing models. The next step in error analysis is explanation. This is the crucial goal of error analysis. This involves attributing the errors to their sources, or finding the sources of errors. Why does the error occur? In other words, providing a psycholinguistic explanation to error production. The role that the explanation of learner idiosyncrasies plays in deepening our insights about the process of second language acquisition at large is of paramount importance. In other words, when we learn about why learners make errors, certain errors, we understand a lot about the process of second language acquisition. Let's return to contrastive analysis. In contrastive analysis, all errors are attributed to the influence of the first language or interference from L1. But this is not the case in error analysis. In the paradigm of error analysis, many other sources are recognized. We may ask a question here: to what extent is the explanation of errors exact if we compare it with the description? In other words, is it easy to say that such an error is caused by L1 or caused by L2 or by some other factor? Is it that easy? Certainly not. The explanation of errors involves some kind of speculation. Determining the sources of errors is still speculative. However, a number of hypothesized causes have been influential in the literature, the most prevalent of which are three. The first is transfer errors. They reflect the effect of L1, the learner's first language, on L2 learning. In this case, the errors are interlingual errors. So here error analysis does not reject that some of the errors, I say some, are caused by L1. The second cause of errors is L2 itself. In that case, the errors are analogical errors, or also called developmental errors or intralingual errors. These errors relate to the structure of L2, the complexity of the target language, and the learning process. The third source of errors is teaching itself. We call this kind of errors teaching-induced errors or simply induced errors. Sometimes they are also called context-based errors. They result from the teaching methodology employed. Sometimes a structure is not well presented by the teacher, and sometimes it is well presented but may be overemphasized to the point of leading the learner to deviate. Pitcorder regards this type of deviation as redundant and avoidable. They have nothing to do with the learning process itself, the cognitive aspect of the learning process. It is an oversimplification to say that all the errors produced by learners are caused by these three factors. A number of other sources were provided in the literature to account for how and why errors occur. Their diversity reflects the fact that many factors come into play when deciding to attribute the errors to their postulated causes. The next stage is the evaluation of errors. Evaluation of errors is for interest to the teachers. Also is the correction of errors. Evaluation means the assessment of the seriousness of each inaccuracy, depending on its kind and its frequency, how often it is repeated in the learner's production. This is called error gravity. At this stage, the researcher will ask himself whether an error is really serious or not. It's not easy to decide on the seriousness of errors. Researchers have set different standards in their evaluation of errors. Corder, for example, mentions two types of criteria: the linguistic criterion and the communicative criterion. The linguistic evaluation of errors consists in setting linguistic touchstones to measure the degree of deviance from the target form. For example, the researcher will focus on the number of the rules which are violated, or the type of rules which are violated. Also, the researcher will classify the errors as syntactic, semantic, or something else. And on this basis, he can decide whether an error is serious or not. Sometimes researchers focus on whether an error is global or local. A global error is one which involves the whole structure of a sentence. Everything is wrong. And a local error is one which affects a particular constituent or part of a sentence. In the examples that we have, we notice that the errors are just local. They do not affect all the sentence. Let's take a real example. Sometimes teachers collect texts from their learners and try to see the extent to which they are erroneous. Some texts are correctable, but others are not. I mean that in some texts there are specific parts of the text which contain deviations, and this allows the researcher or the teacher to help the learner. But in other texts, the problems in language cover all the structure from beginning to end. Everything is wrong in the text. This is the case of global errors. Global errors are generally seen as more serious than local errors. If we take the second type of evaluation, which is communicative evaluation, here the researcher assesses the seriousness of errors in terms of the effect they have on the efficiency of communication. Some deviations hinder comprehensibility. They prevent you from understanding what the learner means totally. Some other deviations do not. You understand generally the intentions of the learners. And this has nothing to do with the linguistic form. It is argued that global errors, those which affect the whole structure, impede communication. They are obstacles to communication, while local errors do not. These are the most well-known criteria to identify. The last stage of error analysis is correction of errors. This stage is also of interest to teachers. This is a vast area of research. The correction of errors involves giving feedback on errors. This is closely related to evaluation. That is to say, if something is serious, probably it needs feedback. If it is not that serious, we may overlook the stage of giving feedback. So an erroneous bit of language cannot be corrected unless its seriousness is evaluated. Research on error correction methods is not all conclusive. It's still developing on the most effective method or technique for error correction. The problem of language teachers lies in determining what to correct and how to correct. This may be related to the skill which is being taught, like speaking, writing, the aspect of language which is being taught in general. It is also related to the method of teaching. Different methods have different attitudes towards correction and use different ways of dealing with the deviations of the learners. In error correction, different tendencies can be distinguished. For some analysts, treatment of errors is undertaken on linguistic grounds, language grounds. For example, the frequency of an error, if an error is frequently repeated by the learner, or sometimes the degree of its linguistic deviance, very deviant or just slightly deviant. The second trend here favors the correction of erroneous utterances in terms of their interference with comprehensibility. The proponents of this trend favor the correction of global errors only. The third trend, which is a current tendency, is to incorporate the affective or the psychological factors in error treatment, to pay attention to the psychological state of the learner. We should not forget that learners are affected by the feedback that we give them, sometimes positively but sometimes negatively. So in the extreme form of this last trend, no direct treatment is recommended. I mean that the proponents of this trend say that we should not treat errors at all. And they believe that this is similar to the natural environment of learning one's first language or second language. When I say a natural environment, like the environment of the baby or the environment of an immigrant who lives in a foreign country. They say that correction inhibits learning. It stops learning. It may affect also the flow of communication, especially. A last trend in concerning correction of errors favors an immediate treatment of every error at the moment it is made. You see here that they take the opposite direction. The argument of this last trend, or the counterclaim, is that when we tolerate erroneous utterances, we are giving a kind of positive feedback that leads the learner to internalize, to keep the incorrect forms in the same way he does with the correct ones. When this happens, we say that the incorrect form fossilizes. It is Selinker who has coined the term fossilization to refer to this phenomenon, of course. An excellent example of fossilization is a foreign accent, like mine. You notice that someone who is not living in the environment where the target language is spoken, that person will keep his pronunciation forever. By contrast, if the same person is moved to a new environment where the target language is spoken everywhere, communication is totally done in the target language, the speaker will be forced to correct himself and to change his accent accordingly. In the case of fossilization, the learner does not try to use a more refined and sophisticated form. He just keeps the one that he has. He notices that this form satisfies his communicative needs, and there is no problem when he speaks. People understand him. So the learner gets by with what he knows of the target language. We have examined 4 trends concerning the correction of errors. Balancing these various perspectives, we can safely conclude that a perceptive language teacher, who is supported by a clear understanding of the nature and the source of each error, is advised to handle these sensitive spots in learning with great care to attain a more efficient teaching and a better learning of the target language. Error analysis was criticized in its approach and in the methodology used. In all the stages of analyzing errors, the focus is only on errors, the deviant forms. Many researchers now try to add non-errors or the successes in learning the language alongside the errors in their description. They believe that if we take both of them at the same time, we'll have a better description or better account of L2 learning. The picture will be clearer. The learner has failures and has successes when learning the second language, and it is believed that the failures should not be permitted to eclipse the successes of the language learner. The error analysis approach focuses just on the products of second language learners. As a result, it tended to neglect the process of learning itself. Error analysis was replaced by performance analysis, which is also called interlanguage analysis. The attention in performance analysis is no longer focused on the deviations only from the target language norms at a given point in time, but also it includes the process of L2 learning as a whole. It includes the development of the various systems like the tense system, the quotient system, preposition system, article system of the target language as well. The researcher traces the development of these systems in the learner's language. He pays attention to both the successes and the failures. The performance analysis approach examines the performance of the second language learners from many angles, so it is more comprehensive than error. In performance analysis, researchers trace, for example, the syntactic development, or the morphological developments, the lexical developments, the phonological developments. Generally, much more research has been done into syntactic and morphological development. This is known as morphological studies. Performance analysis may take a longitudinal approach, that is, along a period of time, but it can also be done cross-sectionally at one point in time. A lot of research into language development is cross-sectional, which has to do with the fact that longitudinal research is by definition time-consuming and with difficulty involved in applying it to large numbers of informants. On the whole, we say that performance analysis includes error analysis, and error analysis includes contrastive analysis. They come in the form of a chronology, one follows the other, but they do not reject each other. They criticize and add. Despite the weaknesses of error analysis, it continues to provide important hints at the possible relationship between the classroom and the psycholinguistic questions language learning. Error analysis has broadened the view of second language and foreign language learning due to its cognitive orientation, principally. Error analysis does not look at errors as fatal to proper learning. On the contrary, it considers them as indicators of learning. The proponents of error analysis emphasize great potential for deriving practical insights about teaching just from a clear understanding of the learning process, which is reflected through error making. We can also say that error analysis subsumes contrastive analysis, because contrastive analysis is resorted to only to explain a portion of the errors that the learners commit, not all of them, those which result from L1 interference. But contrastive analysis alone fails to handle a large portion of such deviations, which are attributable to L2 complexity or even to teaching. Error analysis was also criticized in its approach and methodology, but despite its weaknesses, it continues to give us important insights about the relationship between the classroom and questions of language learning.